Well, thank you. It is an honor and a pleasure to introduce Professor Sally Scholz, this year's recipient of the Outstanding Faculty Research Award. Professor Scholz joined our faculty in philosophy in 1994, immediately after completing her PhD at Purdue University with a dissertation titled "The Legitimating Function of the Dichotomy of the Public and the Private in Systemic Oppression." I mention this old text to make the point that interests in political philosophy and the politics of oppression that recur again and again in her published works are deeply rooted in Professor Scholz's research. We find evidence of this rootedness in the titles of the 19 peer-reviewed chapters Professor Scholz has contributed to anthologies published by the presses at Lexington Books, Verlag Karl Albert, Springer, State University of New York, Georgetown University, Rhodope, Rowman and Littlefield, Edwin Mellon, and the Philosophy Documentation Center. These titles include Rousseau on Poverty, Innocence and Vulnerability, Existence, Freedom, and the Festival, War Rapes, Challenge to Just War Theory, The Dignity of Work and Economic Concerns, and the Challenge of Systemic Oppression. More evidence of this rootedness can be found in the 21 peer-reviewed articles Professor Scholz has published in the journals Ethics and the Environment, Journal of Social Philosophy, International Journal of Applied Philosophy, Political Theory, Philosophy Today, Clio, a journal of literature, history, and philosophy of history, and importantly, Hypatia, a journal of feminist philosophy. Feminism, a critical response to what it is fair to describe as a species of systemic oppression, is a very important branch of Professor Scholz's research interests in political philosophy, and this branch has borne considerable fruit. We find this fruit on offer in articles like That All Children Should Be Free, Beauvoir, Rousseau, and Childhood, Adoption, Artificial Reproductive Technologies, and a Reconception of the Maternal Body, co-authored with Professor Sarah von Brakeman, Writing for Liberation, Simone de Beauvoir and Women's Writing, Peacemaking in Domestic Violence, The Duty of Solidarity, Catholic Social Teaching and Feminist Moral Theory, and Reproductive Labor, the import of the patriarchal family on Hegel's phenomenology. Besides these peer-reviewed articles and chapters in scholarly books, Professor Scholz has co-edited 3 volumes of essays, Peacemaking, Lessons from the Past, Visions for the Future with Judith Pressler, The Contradictions of Freedom, Philosophical Essays on Simone de Beauvoir with Shannon Musset, and Philosophical Perspectives on Democracy in the 21st Century with Ann Cudd. She also co-edited a special issue of the Journal of Social Philosophy titled Solidarity with Carol Gould, and she edited a special issue of Hypatia titled Crossing Borders. In 2013, Professor Scholz was named general editor of Hypatia for a 5-year term ending in June 2018. This follows her success as editor of the American Philosophical Association newsletter on feminism and philosophy from 2003 to 2008, and as co-editor of the Journal for Peace and Justice Studies from 2006 to 2011. Finally, Professor Scholz is the author of 4 monographs, starting with On de Beauvoir and On Rousseau, both for Wadsworth Publishing in 2000 and 2001, respectively. On de Beauvoir has been translated into Chinese. With One World Publishing in 2010, Professor Scholz published Feminism, A Beginner's Guide. And in 2008, on Penn State Press, Professor Scholz published Political Solidarity. Political Solidarity was nominated for the Victoria Shuck Award, the North American Society for Social Philosophy Book Award, and the American Philosophical Association Book Award. In this last work, Professor Scholz defines solidarity as a unity that binds individuals into an identifiable group formed by a general and shared positive moral obligation that mediates the community and individuals in that community. She distinguishes political solidarity from social and civic solidarity by the conscious commitment of the politically solidary group to challenge injustice, oppression, tyranny, or social vulnerability. This politically solidary group is further defined by shared positive moral obligations. These specific obligations include mutuality, which is the important moral obligation required of members of a solidary group with one another, It requires members to respond appropriately to the needs of fellow members by clear and fair communication and with respect. Social criticism, the specific moral duty that binds the solidarity group to the goal of its group association. And social activism, the specific moral duty that defines the solidarity group in its relationship with the larger social whole. What is distinctive in Professor Scholz's view, apart from his careful delineation of what is necessary and sufficient for distinctively political solidarity, is its claim that a personal commitment to a social justice cause is the only necessary condition for membership in a solidarity group. This means that membership in a solidarity group is not restricted to those who are oppressed or disadvantaged. The claim is rather that the solidarity group is distinct from the oppressed group. An example of this might be the solidarity of otherwise privileged white citizens with oppressed black men and women in the early days of the civil rights movement. Professor Scholz would have us think that those whites, while not oppressed themselves, may have contributed to the political solidarity of the civil rights movement by their capacity to persuade those opposed to that movement and by giving the solidarity group better access to the power structures deployed in that opposition. How do these otherwise advantaged members sign their solidarity with the oppressed and acquire the knowledge needed to participate in solidarity with them? By practicing, Professor Scholz says, the virtues of openness, attentiveness, empathy, and love. Thus, political solidarity, as Professor Scholz conceives it, is framed, the way a house is framed, by moral obligation and enlivened by a shared experience of oppression with the practical virtues of those in solidarity with the oppressed. This view is not impervious to criticism, but that just means there's more work to be done, and the record of scholarly achievement we have just summarized demonstrates that Professor Scholz is up to the task. For the quantity and quality of her work, the commitment throughout her research to solidarity with those who have been systemically oppressed, especially women, I give you Professor Sally Scholz, the deserving recipient of this year's Outstanding Faculty Research Award.
Thank you to me, and most especially all of you here tonight to help me celebrate with my family. I'm truly honored to receive this award. I'm also more than a little intimidated. This is quite a distinguished audience, full of many of the top researchers in the university. Thank you so much for coming and for the honor of allowing me to briefly present a bit about my research today. I'm also a little intimidated for another reason. This is, I think, the first time that I'm presenting notes about my research in front of my teenage children. I've been given strict instructions not to be boring, to which I responded, "You do know I'm a philosopher, right?" You'll notice that they also brought books, word to the wise there. So. Speaking in front of one's teenagers, of course, also includes the very real risk of having whatever I say repeated back to me in startling detail, and I'm just not sure I'm ready for such scrutiny. But nevertheless, here I go. I thought I would start by mentioning what we all have in common. As scholars, we look for the gaps or holes in a field, a space for our own contribution. We're builders, really, or networkers. We build bridges between ideas and topics and subfields and disciplines in our own unique effort to fill in a gap, to contribute to the community of scholars in which we work and live. Looking at my CV, one might be tempted to say that I have rather eclectic interests. That isn't incorrect, but it isn't complete either. I'm still in the process of constructing bridges, and some of them require a lot more detail work than I could have predicted. My early research, as you've heard, was on systemic oppression. I looked at how attempts to theorize a just state or a just state of affairs might actually yield unintentional but nonetheless harmful forms of oppression. This led me in two different directions simultaneously. The first was connected with my first job out of graduate school. I spent a year as a legal advocate for victims of domestic violence. That was an enlightening experience that also demonstrated to me that some of the best feminist arguments were made by non-academics who do not identify as feminists. That little dose of humility, a dose of humility that I highly recommend to all graduate students leaving their programs, helped me to see those areas where academics could actually contribute. We frame and communicate ideas to different audiences. I chose moral, social, and political philosophy. By looking at some of the classic arguments in political theory, I argued that some things like autonomy and social responsibility had to be rethought, given, for instance, the experience of women who suffered abuse in their intimate relations. In philosophy, this approach to drawing on real-world problems, now relatively more common in non-ideal philosophical methodologies, helps, I hope, to demonstrate philosophy's relevance to our individual social and political lives. Of course, violence isn't confined to domestic spheres. Indeed, war, a prominent topic in moral and political philosophy, has been understood as that out of which the need for society at all is created, as well as a sovereign right of states once established. My interest in violence against women and political theory, as well as an early commitment to pacifism that has been more or less consistent over the years, led me to study the ethics of war and the presence of rape in conflict situations as epiphenomenon, tactic, and even strategy in war. The second direction from my early foray in the literature on oppression took me through the writings of Simone de Beauvoir. Beauvoir is arguably the 20th century's most important and influential feminist. Like most existentialists, she's been accused of advocating an individualist ethics. Among other things, Beauvoir did hold the existentialist position that each of us makes our own meaning and that each individual is a sovereign, unique subject amidst a universe of objects. But Beauvoir's existentialist ethics is not only individualistic. In fact, she argues that so long as some people are oppressed, none of us is free. We are tied together in such a way that our projects are bound up with the projects of others. An individual's freedom then presumes solidarity with others. She says, it is true that each is, here I'm quoting her, and unfortunately, Beauvoir was writing in the, here in 1940s, and gender-neutral language had not yet hit the scene, so here we go. She says, it is true that each is bound to all, but that is precisely the ambiguity of his condition, his or her. In his or her surpassing toward others, each one exists absolutely for him or herself. Each is interested in the liberation of all, but as a separate existence engaged in his own projects. End quote. Beauvoir's solidarity ethics arises from an existentialism founded on the individual, and yet, as she argued, the individualism is precisely its strength. Each existent is recognized as unique. The unity of all is a unity of each to every other. Each individual is irreplaceable to the whole. Interestingly, for me at least, Beauvoir was heavily indebted to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and I think you can actually see that in that passage that I just read. Rousseau's social contract theory was an attempt to theorize a just state and thereby remedy what he saw as oppressive relations of inequality. Although sometimes accused of espousing totalitarianism, most political theorists consider Rousseau a champion of democracy and a defender of equality. As Beauvoir noticed, Rousseau's dedication to equality was in the service of freedom. His social contract, together with his theory of education, is a fascinating and much misunderstood attempt to articulate the moral and political requirements of society. Rousseau is considered by most who work on solidarity to be the foundational theorist of the idea. Although he does not use the term, his social contract articulates both some of the basic principles of social solidarity and identifies many of the causes for how and when solidarity goes wrong. As you no doubt have figured out, I work on solidarity as a moral and political concept. This, by the way, may ruin the word for you. It has, I think, for my husband, so you've been warned. Have you noticed how frequently the term is used? Just this morning, I heard it used both to describe the U.S. government's involvement in the Ukraine and the responders' sympathy to the landslide in Oslo, Washington. Yesterday, I heard it used in relation to the runners completing the Boston Marathon. And of course, the Pope recently issued a call for solidarity, especially to those of us who identify as Catholic. We hear it and use it a lot. And we seem to mean something important, something normative when we say it. But can it really be the case that all of these invocations of solidarity carry the same moral weight or normative commitment? Consider two other pertinent examples. The first concerns a debate within the literature on race. W.E. Du Bois used the term racial solidarity to draw out the familial analogy for race, and Elaine Leroy Locke used race solidarity to indicate consciousness of and pride in cultural differences or artistic achievements within racial groups. But he also uses it to indicate the ties that bind whites in a race supremacist society and the bond that forms among colonized people in reactions to the dominance of the colonizer. Contemporary critical race theory further unpacks the term and challenges its social and moral content. What emerges is a complex and at times vague appeal to racial solidarity as an ontological concept, a moral imperative, and as a social descriptor. Some argue that racial solidarity is meaningless because there are no races. Others argue that racial solidarity ought to be analogous to the ideal family and thus justifies giving partial treatment to members of some races so long as no harm is done to others. Still others want to retain the notion of racial solidarity not for its truth or falsity as an ontological concept and not in order to justify moral partiality, but as a recognition of the social construction of race. Clearly, different conceptions of solidarity are at work in at least some of, if not all of these mentions. More often than not, the understanding of solidarity is blurred by scholars use it to discuss by scholars as they use it to discuss external identity, shared experience, shared consciousness, and political resistance separately and simultaneously. The second example is drawn from feminist theory. Since the 1960s, the possibility of solidarity among women has lurked in the background of almost every feminist political theory. Activists in the 1960s and 70s asserted strong connections among all women with their use of the term sisterhood. But sisterhood belied the range of divisions between women and the diversity of oppressive experiences often interconnected with racial and class oppression. This critique, put forth by Bell Hooks, among others, in her well-known essay, Sisterhood, Political Solidarity Between Women, challenged conceptions of solidarity grounded on similar experiences of oppression or shared experience. She argues that male supremacist ideology encourages women to bond only with men. Sisterhood was meant to challenge that by showing women could bond on the basis of our shared oppression. But, as Hooks explains, the idea of common oppression was a false and corrupt platform, disguising and mystifying the true nature of women's varied and complex social reality. Solidarity as a political movement, on the other hand, is built on resistance. It's a struggle and emphasizes shared strengths and resources. Perhaps even more radical, the shift in understanding of solidarity challenged feminists and others who fight for liberation to see connections between their efforts and the efforts of other resistors. One way to think about the apparent perplexity of the concept of solidarity is to scrutinize the social ontology of the group relation described by the term. The social bonds, strength of sentiment, identity, and overlap of interests among people in solidarity differs in many of these examples. Alternatively, since solidarity clearly carries some moral and political import, examining various solidarity relations for that content would clarify things. In my work, I articulate, or I try to articulate, and defend a system of classification for levels and types of solidarity and develop a theory of one of those types. I argue that there are three levels of solidarities. The first and most general level describes the content or expectations of every form of solidarity, thereby identifying the traits that distinguish it from camaraderie, community, association, and other social groupings. This marks solidarity as a morally rich concept in the tradition of collective responsibility and liability. A morally rich concept for political theorists in that it describes some form of unity, however tenuous the members might be united, that mediates between the individual and the community and entails positive moral duties. Each of these components informs the richness of the concept while also contributing to the challenge of articulating a theory of solidarity. From this general level, a second level adds specificity and nuance to the social relations of solidarity. Three types emerge that may be distinguished by their social ontologies, moral relations, and corresponding obligations. Consider, for instance, the solidarity of a tightly knit society. There's something importantly different between the solidarity and the solidarity that unites individual workers in their collective efforts to win free unions or just wages. Similarly, the solidarity that victims of domestic violence share with each other is not equivalent to the solidarity of the social activist movement aimed at changing a culture of abuse. In both cases, the initial sense of solidarity marks the bonds of a community united by some shared characteristic or similarity, or a social solidarity, while the second sort of solidarity indicates political activism aimed at social change, political solidarity. The third sense of solidarity is found in the obligations of civil society to protect citizens against vulnerabilities through the provisions of healthcare, welfare, consumer, and environmental protections. Civic solidarity, and that's the form that you see most prominently displayed in the European Union, and it actually forms part of their fundamental charter. These three types meet the general features of solidarity and even have some other important traits in common. However, their social and moral structures make them distinct forms of solidarity and worthy of separate study. I am, as you've gathered, particularly interested in political solidarity. This is the solidarity of movements, of workers struggling for rights in the workplace and activists seeking to change social structures. Political solidarity marks a social movement wherein individuals have committed to positive duties in response to a perceived injustice. This understanding allows us to dissect its various parts while also maintaining its concreteness or embeddedness in a practical political situation. Individuals commit to a cause and their project becomes meaningful in the engagement with similarly committed others. In this way, the social and political theories of Beauvoir and Rousseau influence a theory of political solidarity. En route to this theory, I lay out a social ontology of political solidarity, set a framework for categorizing the moral relationships within it, and address some potentially troubling epistemological questions regarding authentic participation in solidarity. One of the examples I use to illustrate the various relations of solidarity is the global feminist response to war rape. Hence, as you see, I'm working on building some bridges and networks between various areas of social and political and feminist philosophy. These various interconnected elements of my research continue to intertwine in my current research project on global feminisms and human rights. I use the concept of solidarity employed quite explicitly among transnational and global feminists to explore the feminist responses to globalization and the evaluation of human rights discourse. All along this long research journey, I have been very grateful to a lively group of social philosophers and a wonderful community of feminist philosophers with significant overlap between these two groups for their criticisms, challenges, support, and encouragement. Philosophers can genuinely have fun engaging in good argument. I have had a lot of fun, and I look forward to many more years of arguing. I believe in the power of ideas, and while I'm certain I don't always get things right, I do believe the process of considering and critiquing ideas of others and getting that criticism in return has been invaluable to my thinking. So to those of you who are members of that community, as well as members of the wider scholarly community, I thank you very much for your criticism, for your attention, and for even just engaging in ideas with me. Thank you.